Alright, today I'm going to be installing Arch Linux. So now, in case you are unfamiliar, Arch Linux is a Linux distribution that's aimed at expert Linux users. The idea is that you start with a very minimal Arch ISO, which is just a command line interface, and then you build the system into a complete operating system. And this means that you install and configure everything manually without the aid of an installer. This means that you format and partition the drive, you generate the locales and the fs tab, and you create the swap file or the swap partition, depending on which one you prefer, and you install the Linux kernel and the base system and whatever you want installed, including the display server, the display manager, and the desktop environment. And in case you have no idea what those last three things I just mentioned are, simply put, the display server is in charge of displaying your graphical user interface. The display manager is in charge of logging you into your graphical session, and it also defines the look and feel of your login screen. And the desktop environment is basically the look and feel of your Linux desktop once you are logged in. So obviously Arch Linux isn't really meant for someone who is new to Linux. It's meant for a Linux user who is more experienced and is wanting to try their hand at building a Linux system from scratch, almost, and really isn't afraid to get their hands dirty and mess around with the command line and all that jazz. And the reason why I'm calling this an Arch Linux installation guide rather than a tutorial on how to install Arch Linux is because, unlike a beginner-friendly distro like Ubuntu or Linux Mint, there's no one way to install Arch Linux. With Arch Linux, you can install basically any desktop environment you like, any display manager you like, and any display server you like, or even none at all if you just want a command line only experience. But without further ado, let's get into actually installing Arch Linux. Alright, so now the website is archlinux.org, and then what we're going to do is go to download here, and then that'll bring us to the Arch Linux download page, which I'll have linked in the description. But anyway, we actually get quite a few options for downloading. My preferred method is actually to use a BitTorrent client like Transmission, which comes pre-installed on a lot of Linux distributions, and then get the torrent for Arch Linux, since this I find is much faster than, say, a direct download. But if you'd rather go that route, you can select your local mirror and then download it from there. But anyway, I've actually already downloaded the Arch ISO, and I've got it loaded in this virtual machine. So I'm gonna go start it up, boot into my Arch ISO. Alright, so now here it brings us to the command line, and this is where we're gonna build our Arch Linux installation. So now, the very first thing you're gonna do, if you're using a keyboard layout other than English US, is set the console keyboard layout. So to do that, we're going to just do ls/usr/kbd/keymaps/*****map.gz, and then a couple angled brackets and keymaps. And then that outputted that command to a file called keymaps, which we're going to now open by typing in nano keymaps. And the reason why I did it this way is that way you can scroll through it, since there's a lot of stuff in here that this command outputs. So basically you're going to go through here and find your keyboard layout, and then once you've found it, what you're going to do is type load keys, and then the file name excluding the path and the file extension. So for example, if I wanted to set the German keyboard layout, I would type de-latin 1, and then that'll set it to a German layout. So now, if you're using the English US keyboard, the default keyboard layout for the Arch Linux ISO is English US, so if you're like me, you don't need to worry about this. Moving right along, the next thing we're going to do is verify the boot mode by typing in ls/sys/firmware/efi/efi-vars. And then if it gives you an output, then it means you're booted into UEFI mode. If it gives you no such file or directory, then that means you're booted into legacy mode. And this is important since this will affect how we're going to install Arch Linux. Now, I'm demonstrating this on a UEFI system, but it's not too much different on a legacy system. In fact, installing it on a UEFI system is a little bit more complicated, which is part of the reason why I'm demonstrating on a UEFI system, and also because that's what I'm sure most of you have, because basically any computer bought since 2014 is going to have a UEFI BIOS. But anyway, the next thing we're going to do is verify our internet connection, and I will say that if you're using a Wi-Fi connection, you're going to connect using the iwctl utility, and then if you just type help here, you can get the commands for it. And if you look at the official Arch Linux installation guide, which is what this video is based on, you can find instructions on how to connect to a Wi-Fi network from there. But anyway, I'm gonna quit out of this since I'm using Ethernet, or rather, more particular to my case, since this is virtual machine, a virtual network adapter. If you're like me and you're using an Ethernet connection, then things will be much easier for you because in that case, you should already be connected to the internet. To verify this, just do ping any website that can accept ICMP pings. An example would be archlinux.org. Hit enter, and then it should be able to ping. If that's the case for you, then you are connected to the internet. So the next thing we're going to do is enable NTP, or Network Time Protocol, on our Arch installation by typing in time date CTL set-ntp true. Then hit enter, and it's not going to give you an output. Alright, so now we actually start to get into installing Arch Linux, starting off with partitioning and formatting the drive. So first thing I'm going to do is lsblk. What lsblk does is gives you all the drives connected to our system. Now the only one we need to worry about is our internal drive, which is probably going to be the biggest one in there. For most of you, this is going to be SDA. However, in my case, since I'm using a virtual machine, I actually get VDA. But anyway, once we know our drive name, what we're going to do is do cfdisk/dev/ our drive name. Now this whole thing /dev/ your drive name is what I like to call your drive path. This is basically where your drive lives in the file system. In my case, it's cfdisk/dev/VDA. However, for most of you, it's going to be /dev/SDA. But anyway, I'm going to hit enter. And since I'm using UEFI, I'm going to do GPT. However, if you're on legacy, then you do DOS. And then what I'm going to do is create a new partition, make that 512 megs, hit enter, and then change the partition type to EFI system. And then this is going to be our EFI system partition, and take note of the device labels since we will need those to format the partitions. And then what we're going to do with our remaining free space is basically create one big root partition, and it's already Linux file system, which is perfect for us. And then we're going to write the changes by hitting write and then typing yes. And enter, now they've been written. And by the way, if you're doing this in a legacy environment, you can just create one big partition as your root partition. Like, you don't need to worry about the EFI system partition since you don't have that in legacy. And then in that case, you'd flag your root partition as bootable. Now, since I'm in a UEFI environment and I'm working with a GPT partitioning scheme, there is no such thing as a bootable flag for me. But anyway, now that I've written the changes, I'm going to quit out of cfdisk. And now we get to formatting our partitions, starting off with their EFI system partition, which we're going to do mkfs.fat to format it as fat32, and then our EFI system partition, which in my case is dev vda1. For most of you, it's going to be dev SDA1, then hit enter. And now for our root partition, I'm going to do mkfs.ext4 to format it with the ext4 file system, and then type /dev/vda2. For most of you, it's going to be dev sda2. But anyway, I'm going to hit enter, and there you go. Now our drive is all partitioned and formatted, and now it's ready to be mounted. So what I'm going to do is go mount our root partition to /mnt, since that's the convention. And then for our EFI system partition, we're going to create the EFI directory for it. So we're going to do mkdir-p/mnt/boot/EFI. There you go. And then we can mount our EFI system partition 2/mnt/boot/EFI. And by the way, if you're doing this in a legacy environment, you can obviously skip formatting the EFI system partition and mounting it, since in that case you won't have an EFI system partition. But anyway, now that we've actually got our target drive mounted, the very first thing I'm going to do is create a swap file. Now, if you prefer a swap partition, then make sure to do that while partitioning the drive, but I personally prefer a swap file. So what I'm going to do is fallocate-l, our desired swap file size, and I'm only going to give it 2 gigs here. No sense in creating a giant swap file thinking you'll get more RAM. Pro tip, swap files don't work that way. They just act as a buffer for inactive data in your RAM. It just helps to reduce your memory usage. But anyway, I'm going to do fallocate-l 2 gigs/mnt/swap file. And then we're going to change the permissions on that swap file to make it more secure. So we're going to do chmod 600/mnt/swap file. And then we're going to do mkswap/mnt/swap file. And then we're going to do swap on/mnt/swap file. And then we can verify this with the free command, which will show us our RAM. In this virtual machine, I'm only working with 4 gigs of RAM, so having a swap file can actually help in this case. And as we can see here, our swap file is active, even though it's not currently being used, because the system just doesn't need to. But anyway, now that we have our swap file set up, now we can get to installing the base system. So what I'm going to do is type pacstrap/mnt, and then what I'm going to do is install the packages base linux-firmware. This is basically the bare minimum that you need for an Arch Linux installation. You get the base packages and the Linux kernel. And Linux firmware provides non-free drivers for hardware. If you're an open source purist and you want to leave that out, by all means go do that. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to go install the Linux firmware package. And then in addition to the base packages, I'm also going to install a few extra packages, which are Nano, Network Manager, and Grub. So now Nano is basically a text editor, which is going to be really nice to have once we chroot into our Arch Linux system. And then Network Manager is pretty much self-explanatory. It's what manages your networks on your Arch Linux desktop. And then Grub is basically the bootloader that we're using. Now, if you're doing this in a UEFI environment, you're also going to need to install EFI boot mgr. Otherwise, it'll give you an error while installing Grub. But anyway, I'm going to hit enter, and then we'll go install the base system along with the other packages I've thrown in there. By the way, if you're doing this on a physical machine, you should also install the appropriate microcode package for your CPU by adding Intel-U code or AMD-U code for Intel and AMD CPUs respectively. But anyway, this will take a while, so I'll speed this up. Alright, so that didn't take awfully long. Now, how long this takes for you will depend largely on the speed of your internet connection. But anyway, the very last thing we're going to do before we chroot into our Arch Linux install is generate our fstab file. So to do that, I'm going to do gen fstab-U/mnt, and then what the -U does is it tells gen fstab to use UUIDs rather than device labels. And this is actually good practice, just in case one of your partitions is unmountable for whatever reason, then it's not going to try to go mount some other partition in its place, which could cause a whole host of hard to pin down issues. But anyway, I'm going to go output this to /mnt/etc/fstab. And then you may want to verify this by removing the angled brackets and then our output file. But anyway, I'm going to go output this to our fstab file. And now we can finally chroot into our Arch Linux install by doing arch-chroot/mnt. Now we're in our Arch Linux install. So the first thing we're going to do is set our time zone by doing ln-sf/usr/share/zone info/ and then we're going to select our region and our city. Now, in order to see what regions are available, we can actually do tab here. You may actually need to press it twice, and then we can see all the regions here. Now, I'm in the Americas, so I'm going to put in America / and then to see the cities in that again, and then in this case I have to hit Y since there's quite a few possibilities. And then I am in America / Toronto. So now, obviously this will change depending on where you live. Like, for example, if you're over in India, you're not going to go America / Toronto. No, you're going to do, I think, Indian / whatever your region is. But anyway, then we're going to link that to /etc/ local time, then hit enter. And now we're going to do HW clock -- sys to HC to set our hardware clock. And now, once we're done setting our time zone, we're going to generate our locales. So first thing we're going to do is nano /etc/ locale.gen, and then hit enter. And then you're going to go find your locale, which for me is en_ca, since I use Canadian English. And then you're going to get the UTF-8 one, which we can select our locale by uncommenting it in our locale.gen file. Now, if you're using, for example, English US, you're not going to uncomment en_ca. No, you're going to uncomment en_us. But anyway, now we can Control X, hit Y to save it, and then enter. And then all we have to do is do locale-gen, and it should generate our locale. And by the way, you can have it generate multiple locales by simply uncommenting multiple locales in your locale.gen file. And now we're going to do echo lang equals our locale, which in my case is en_ca.utf-8, and then we're going to output that to /etc/locale.conf. And then while you're at it, if you change the console keyboard layout from the default, we're going to do echo key map equals your key map, which you put into load keys in the beginning. I'm going to use the German keyboard example, D-Latin1, and then you're going to output that to /etc/vconsole.conf. Now, if you're using the default keyboard layout, which again is English US, you can skip this command. Since I'm using English US, I don't need to worry about this. But anyway, now we get to setting our host name, and to do that, you're going to do echo your host name of choice. I'm going to pick Arch Linux, since that's what I've called this VM. And then you're going to output that to /etc/hostname. Okay, now we're going to set our root password. So to do that, we're going to do passwd. And this is to prevent unauthorized access to our root account. Since the root account basically has all the power on our system, that's something you really don't want to leave open. So we're going to set a password on that. Make sure that this is a strong password, preferably one that's generated by a password manager. And now what we're going to do is create a non-privileged user account in order to log into our desktop, which first of all is for security reasons, because you don't want to be using the root account as your main account, because you don't want to give applications all the privileges on your system by default, which would be really bad for obvious reasons. And also because a lot of desktop environments won't allow you to log in as root. So what we're going to do is do usermod -m, and then we're going to type our username. I pick Drew, and then we're going to hit enter. So now the usermod command won't prompt you to set a password, and we're going to want a password on our non-privileged user for what I hope are obvious reasons. So we're going to do passwd, our username, and then set a password for that. Okay, so now that we've got our root password set and our non-privileged user account set up, we're going to install our bootloader, which in our case is grub. So we're going to do grub-install our drive path, which in this case is dev vda. Again, for most of you, it's going to be dev sda, and then hit enter, and then it's going to go install grub, right? And then it should say installation finished, no error reported. And then if you wanted to change some grub settings, you can do that by doing nano/etc/default/grub, and then this is where you can access your grub settings. A common example is if you want to set up a dual boot, you'll have to uncomment grub disable OS prober equals false, so it will run OS prober, which basically detects other operating systems that you may have installed. Now, it mentions that this is disabled for security reasons, so if you're not running a multi-boot setup and you don't need this, I would just leave this off. But anyway, if you don't have any settings that you want to change, you can actually just skip this. But anyway, now we're going to generate our grub configuration by doing grub-mk config-o/boot/grub/grub.cfg, and then hit enter, and then it'll generate our grub configuration. Okay, and then once that's done, we're going to get to installing our desktop environment. So now the easiest one to install is KDE, and I'll show you why in a second, with a couple packages that Arch purists absolutely do not want you to know about. I'm going to type pacman-s, and then the packages I'm going to install are plasma-meta and KDE-applications. And what Plasma Meta is basically a meta package that will basically install the KDE desktop for you, along with the display server, display manager, and everything. And then KDE applications will basically install all the KDE applications for you, so you get a more complete desktop environment right out of the gate. But anyway, I'm gonna hit enter, and then basically it's gonna ask you a few questions. You can just leave this all at default by just hitting enter through all of these, and then we can proceed with our installation by hitting enter once more, and then it'll go install our KDE Plasma and our KDE applications. And I can already hear Arch purists screaming out in rage for going against Arch's whole do-it-yourself ethos. But anyway, this will take a while, so I'll speed this up. Alright, now that our desktop environment's installed, the very last thing we're going to do before we reboot into our new Arch Linux installation is do systemctl enable sddm, which will configure Arch Linux to start our graphical user interface on boot. And then while we're at it, I'm also going to add in network manager, because it's nice to have internet on boot. But anyway, I'm going to hit enter, and then it should create a few symlinks. And now what we're going to do is exit out of our chroot environment and reboot into our new Arch Linux install. Alright, so now we get our grub bootloader here. I'm going to boot into Arch Linux. Alright, now I've got our graphical user interface, which I know this looks pretty ugly out of the box, but we can fix that. But for now, we're just going to log in to our user account, and then it'll bring us into KDE Plasma. Alright, now let's go into our system settings. And actually, while I'm here, I'm going to change this to the dark theme. Now, I know I could have done this later, but since I'm here, why would I? It's literally a 2-second thing. But anyway, what I'm going to do is go down to my display and monitor, and then the very first thing I'm going to do is tackle this display scaling. It's more because I'm in a virtual machine. If you were doing this on bare metal, you shouldn't need to worry about this. But anyway, my native screen resolution is 1360 by 768. I know I have a crappy screen resolution, but the closest one I have is 1360 by 768. Close enough. Okay, so now we got our display at full size. Well, close enough to full size that you can see everything that's going on here in widescreen. But anyway, now let's get into some post-installation stuff. Starting off with our users, I'm going to go to my account type and change it to administrator. And then while I'm here, I'm going to add in my full name, then click apply. And then we're going to have to punch in our root password. This basically gives us administrator privileges on the desktop environment. If we want administrative privileges in the terminal, we have to do a couple extra steps, which I'll go over a little bit later, but for now, let's actually tackle that ugly login screen by going to Startup and Shutdown, and then we basically select a login screen theme here by clicking on it. I actually like the breeze since it matches with our desktop environment. But anyway, I'm going to click apply, and then we should be able to punch in our user password. And now we actually have to reboot the system for that change to take effect. But before we do, let's go ahead and allow our user to use the sudo command. So what we need to do is switch user to root by typing su and then punching in our root password. And then we need to get the sudo package by typing pacman -s sudo, then hit enter, enter again, and then this shouldn't take very long to install at all. But anyway, what we're going to do is do nano /etc /sudoers, and then we're going to scroll all the way to the bottom, and then uncomment %sudo all, and then we're going to control X, then hit enter. And now what we're going to do is create the sudo group by typing groupadd sudo, then hit enter. And now we have to add our user to the sudo group by typing usermod -a capital G space sudo and then our username, then hit enter. Now our user should be a member of the sudo group. However, we actually need to log out and then log back in for that change to apply. But since we have to reboot anyway, might as well reboot now and then apply both our login screen preferences and our sudo privileges with one reboot. And there you go. It looks like our login screen is set. Looks much better than it did. Too bad you can't really do much about that mouse cursor. And because I'm in a virtual machine, I can't really do much about that login screen display scaling, but at least it's now only on the login screen. But anyway, now we're going to go back into our terminal. And then what we're going to do to test to make sure that we have sudo privileges is just do sudo -v, and then we're going to punch in our password, and then it should give us no output. Now, if it says that your user is not in the sudoers file, then you did something wrong with that whole setup, and you will actually also get that error if you didn't create the sudo group and add yourself to it, or you didn't reboot after doing it, or you didn't uncomment the %sudo line in the sudoers file. So if you didn't do either one of those things and you're getting that error, make sure you go back and do them. But anyway, I also will point out before I close off this video that by default, Discover doesn't work for installing applications. It's actually a pretty easy fix. All we have to do is just go back into our terminal, and then this time we can use the sudo command. So we're going to do sudo pacman -s, and then we just need to get a couple packages, namely package kit-qt5 for our applications and fwupd for our firmware updates. Then hit enter. We're going to punch in our password and then hit enter again to proceed with the installation. Now you could always just do su and then run the pacman command if you don't want to go through the effort to get sudo up and running or you have issues with it. But anyway, now that those packages are installed, we can close out of our terminal and then open up Discover again to see if that works. And yep, it's actually looking for applications and updates. Looks like we are up to date, and it's finding applications. And I'm sure you could figure out how to install applications through here. It's pretty self-explanatory. Not too much different than what you're used to on any other Linux distribution. But anyway, congratulations. You just did your first Arch Linux install. And that's it for this video. I hope I've assisted you in doing your first Arch Linux install and getting a complete system that you could, at least in theory, use as a daily driver. If I did, be sure to leave a thumbs up, leave a comment, leave a subscription, and share it with your friends who may also be interested in this video, and thanks for watching.